Depression? Isn't that just a fancy word for feeling bummed out?
Dwight, you ignorant!
All right, Michael, I think I'll take it from here. So, my name is Maddie Amico, and based on my previous experience and extensive research, Michael Scott surprisingly has a pretty good point when it comes to this clip. Depression is more than just feeling bummed out. So, let me ask you, how many of you have ever once said, "Oh, I studied so hard for that exam and I can't believe I failed it, I'm so depressed," or how many of you ever said, "I can't believe he broke my heart, I couldn't stop crying, I'm so depressed"? Now, does this necessarily mean that you're depressed? Maybe. So let's look at the difference between what does depression mean versus transient sadness that we feel from day to day. Well, according to the DSM-5, depression is characterized by the following: a loss of interest, an inability to feel pleasure in things that we love to do, a negative self-view, excessive tiredness to the point where it interferes with our daily activities, as well as difficulty concentrating. So you can see that this makes it pretty hard to deal with daily life. Now, some people who have depression couple that with anxiety. And now anxiety is defined by the following: self-manufactured worry, agitation, nervousness, hyperactivity, and difficulty sleeping. So when these two conditions overlap, we enter something known as the danger zone. What does the danger zone actually entail, you might ask? Well, the danger zone is where we have a physical manifestation of these symptoms in the form of heart palpitations, high blood pressure, and suicidal ideation. So the goal with depression and anxiety therapy is to get ourselves out of the danger zone and to try to limit these symptoms that we might be experiencing as well. So you might be asking yourself, Maddie, I've never once felt anxious or depressed in my life. What the heck does this have to do with me? Well, about 3 weeks ago, I actually sent out a survey. But before I get into those results, I want you to know that up-to-date reports that depression exists in about 28% of the population, as well as anxiety only exists in about 16% of the population. You might be thinking, that's not a whole lot, you're not really making a good case here. But if I look at the results from the first question that I asked you on that survey, you'll see 50% of people actually complain about anxiety, depression, or both. So the next question was, how many of these people in this blue segment here are currently being treated with prescription medications? 85% of these people are currently being treated with depression medications. So if we go back and I ask you to look to your left and to your right, you will see that one of those two people are currently dealing with these problems, and the majority of them are on medications for these problems. The next logical question was, well, how effective are these medications for these people? Are they experiencing relief from their symptoms? Only 36% of you are experiencing relief from your therapy, and 64% of you have not. So why is this okay? Why is this ratio of 36% remission and 64% struggling is okay? Why are prescribers and physicians continuing to prescribe therapy that doesn't seem to work? Well, let's talk about a simple and common genetic mutation that can actually undermine your depression therapy. So before we get into this though, I want to first describe to you what the brain chemistry differences are between a depressed brain versus a healthy brain. And then secondly, I want to also talk about how does this genetic mutation actually impact your current depression therapy. And thirdly, I also want to talk about how a common vitamin supplement can actually be used to treat and provide hope for these patients. And lastly, if you don't even remember anything that I have to say today, I want you all to remember one thing. Not all hope is lost. Struggling is not okay. Now, before we dive in, again, first, I want to talk about the brain chemistry that is involved behind depression. So first, we have to understand how the neural pathways in our brain actually work. In order to communicate between cell to cell, we use electricity as well as chemical messengers that travel between neurons in order to send messages. These chemical messengers, also known as neurotransmitters, provide a specific message that they carry from cell to cell. That means when they bind to a receptor, they create a very specific response in return. So let's take a look at a model that will describe the little highways in our brain.
In this model, we show a neuron, kind of like a little highway in the brain, that is sending 3 specific neurotransmitters to a part of our brain: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. All 3 of these neurotransmitters work together to help us feel focused, energized, as well as happy. So, in depression, we typically see 2 things that happen. First, the neurotransmitters do not stay connected to the receptors long enough to create a lasting response. We typically treat this part of depression with a medication known as an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, a fancy name for something that plugs the escape routes of these neurotransmitters so that they can stay on the receptor longer. Second, people with depression tend to have fewer neurotransmitters than a healthy brain. This part can be treated with a vitamin supplement called Deplin, which increases the number of neurotransmitters. So when used together, Deplin and SSRI provide better relief than an SSRI alone.
So now that we have a general idea of how the brain works in depression, now we must take into account the specific enzyme that is responsible for creating our neurotransmitters, and that is called MTHFR. Now, a gene specifically codes for this enzyme, and when that gene is disrupted, so is the enzyme. But what exactly does this enzyme do? Well, like all the chemicals that are in our body, hormones, neurotransmitters, as well as other types of proteins that we have, this all comes from our diet. Specifically, one B vitamin called folate, which we get from our green leafy vegetables, plays a particularly important role when it comes to creating neurotransmitters. In fact, let's take a look at a simple analogy that I like to use to describe this complex pathway that occurs in our body every single day with just a simple analogy that we like to use as a walnut.
So to give life to this whole pathway, we have our nutcracker, and that's going to be our enzyme MTHFR in our body, and then this walnut's going to represent the folate we get from our diet. Now, in order for us to even use folate, we have to activate it, and that's what our MTHFR is going to do. It's going to crack it open, and we're going to show that we have activated folate, which is the walnuts coming out of the shell, and that's going to be methylfolate. Now, in order to make our neurotransmitters, though, we needed to chop up the methylfolate a little bit more, and that's going to create our serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine.
According to Tracy Stein from Psychology Today, 40% of patients currently have some sort of MTHFR gene mutation, which then inevitably messes with the nutcracker. So what would happen if we take away the nutcracker? Well, let's take a look.
You're going to see how difficult it is just to convert folate into L-methylfolate. Now, it's not impossible for these patients. It just takes a really long time to make neurotransmitters. We can make up for this slowness by giving patients Deplin, and this is an oral synthetic L-methylfolate supplement. This helps to bypass that slow pathway in order to create new neurotransmitters for these patients.
L-methylfolate supplementation has provided symptomatic relief for 90% of patients who initially failed SSRI therapy. This is according to a 2018 meta-analysis study published by the clinical journal Perspectives in Psychiatric Care. So, traditionally, SSRI therapy, which is the mainstay therapy for depression and anxiety therapy, we are only addressing one half of a two-branch problem. So we are not replenishing neurotransmitters with SSRI therapy. So by adding L-methylfolate supplementation, or Deplin, also known as the brand name, we are able to take a pharmaceutical-grade FDA-approved vitamin supplement with virtually no side effects, as well as not jeopardizing any current progress you might have made on your current pharmaceutical treatment, and provide optimal relief for these patients. Like most add-on therapies, though, the best progress comes from adding it on to healthy lifestyle choices. So this would include a healthy diet, exercise, and adequate sleep. So when we take into account the brain biochemistry that's involved behind MTHFR mutations and their implications, the biochemistry dictates that the sooner we start treatment and recognize these problems, the chances for remission increase exponentially. So how would you feel if you knew that a simple genetic test could help you and your provider guide you to the most optimal and effective treatment? Would you do it? Well, when we think about MTHFR mutations, we begin to realize that this undercurrent of culture where we think that we are taught and learn these behaviors from someone or something, that we are actually born with an inherent predisposition towards anxiety and depression. So I want you to know that the way that you feel, sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes we don't need to feel ashamed about the way that we feel, how we continuously question ourselves. Why can't I find my laugh? Why can't I smile? Why can't I just be happy? Well, I want you to know we need to stop struggling. We need to stop thinking that struggling is okay. What we need to do is realize that sometimes we just need to add our missing piece. Thank you.